Suzi had been dreaming about the ocean since she was 7 years old, pressing her face against the glass of a local aquarium and watching the fish drift through shafts of filtered light. Now, at 24, she stood on the deck of a dive boat somewhere off the coast of the Florida Keys, pulling on her wetsuit and staring down at the turquoise water below. She had completed her open water certification just 6 months ago, and every dive since had felt like stepping into another universe. But today was different. Today, Suzi was going deeper than she ever had before, and she had a brand new piece of equipment strapped to her wrist that she was still learning to trust. Her dive computer. She turned it over in her hand, watching the display flicker to life as it detected the ambient pressure around her. Her instructor, a weathered man named Marco who had logged over 4,000 dives, leaned over and tapped the screen with a knowing smile. He told her that little device was going to become her best friend underwater. He was not wrong. Before Suzi had purchased her dive computer, she had been using dive tables, those laminated cards covered in numbers and columns that divers use to calculate how long they can stay at a given depth without risking decompression sickness. The tables worked, and they had kept divers safe for decades, but they were static. They gave you a fixed set of rules based on the worst-case scenario. A dive computer, on the other hand, is a dynamic instrument. It continuously monitors your actual depth and time throughout the dive, recalculating your nitrogen absorption in real time. This means that if you spend the first part of your dive at a shallower depth before going deeper, the computer accounts for that. It is not just tracking where you are, it is tracking your entire dive profile and using that information to give you the most accurate picture possible of how much bottom time you have remaining. Suzi had read about this in her certification materials, but seeing the numbers change on her wrist as she descended for the first time with the device was something else entirely. It made the invisible visible. Nitrogen, which is normally just a harmless part of the air we breathe, becomes something you have to manage carefully under pressure. And the dive computer was her guide through that invisible landscape. As Suzi slipped beneath the surface and equalized the pressure in her ears, she glanced at her wrist. The display showed her current depth, her maximum depth reached during the dive, her current dive time, and a number labeled as no decompression limit, which divers often refer to by its full name, no decompression limit time remaining. This was the most critical number on the screen. It told her exactly how many minutes she could remain at her current depth before she would need to make decompression stops on the way up. As long as she stayed within that limit, she could ascend directly to the surface following a safety stop at 5 meters for 3 minutes, which is standard practice. The display also showed her water temperature, which hovered at around 27 degrees Celsius, and a battery indicator sitting comfortably at full charge. She had learned in her pre-dive briefing that different dive computers use different decompression algorithms, which are essentially mathematical models that simulate how nitrogen behaves in your body tissues. Some are more conservative than others, meaning they give you less bottom time to provide a larger safety margin. Suzi had chosen a model that used the Buhlmann algorithm, one of the most widely respected models in recreational and technical diving. About 20 minutes into the dive, Suzi was hovering above a coral formation, watching a sea turtle glide effortlessly through the water when she felt a tap on her shoulder. Marco pointed upward. It was time to begin their ascent. Suzi had been so captivated by the turtle that she had let herself drift slightly deeper than intended, and her no decompression limit time had dropped lower than she expected. She began to ascend, but in her excitement she kicked a little too hard and started rising faster than she should have. Immediately, her dive computer let out a sharp beeping sound, and an arrow on the display began flashing. She had triggered the ascent rate warning. The recommended maximum ascent rate for recreational diving is 9 meters per minute, and she had exceeded it. She slowed herself down, spreading her arms slightly to create drag, and the warning stopped. Marco gave her a thumbs up. It was a small mistake, but an important lesson. Ascending too quickly does not give the nitrogen dissolved in your body tissues enough time to off-gas safely through your lungs. The result can be decompression sickness, a painful and potentially life-threatening condition where nitrogen bubbles form in the bloodstream and tissues. The dive computer had caught her error before it became a problem. Back on the boat, Suzi peeled off her mask and took a long drink of water, while Marco explained what would happen next. They were going to do a second dive after a surface interval of about an hour. During that time, her body would continue to off-gas the nitrogen absorbed during the first dive, but it would not return to a completely clean slate. This is where dive computers really shine compared to traditional dive tables. The computer stores the data from your previous dive and automatically factors the residual nitrogen in your body into the calculations for your next dive. When Suzi entered the water for the second dive, her no decompression limit time was already shorter than it had been at the start of the first dive, even before she had descended a single meter. The computer was accounting for the nitrogen still present in her tissues. This is called a repetitive dive calculation, and it is one of the most important safety features a dive computer provides. Without it, divers relying on tables would need to manually look up their residual nitrogen group and apply corrections, a process that is easy to get wrong, especially when you are tired and excited after a great first dive. On the third day of her trip, Suzi tried something new. She had completed a nitrox certification the previous year, which qualified her to dive with enriched air nitrox, a gas mixture that contains a higher percentage of oxygen than standard air. Standard air contains approximately 21% oxygen, while enriched air nitrox typically contains between 32 and 36% oxygen. The benefit is that with less nitrogen in the mix, your body absorbs nitrogen more slowly, giving you longer no decompression limit times at recreational depths. However, the higher oxygen content also introduces a new risk, oxygen toxicity, which can cause seizures at depth if you exceed the maximum operating depth for your specific gas mixture. Suzi entered her nitrox mix percentage into her dive computer before the dive, and the computer automatically switched to nitrox mode, recalculating all of her limits accordingly. It also displayed a constant readout of her oxygen partial pressure, alerting her if she approached the maximum safe threshold of 1.4 bar. Watching those numbers and understanding what they meant gave Suzi a profound appreciation for how much engineering and science had gone into that small device on her wrist. By the end of the trip, Suzi had logged 8 dives and spent more time studying her dive computer than she had spent looking at her phone. She had learned to read its warnings, trust its calculations, and understand the science behind every number on its display. She understood that a dive computer is not just a gadget, it is a life safety instrument built on decades of physiological research and engineering refinement. It does not replace good training, situational awareness, or the buddy system, but it gives divers a real-time window into processes happening inside their own bodies that would otherwise be completely invisible. As the boat headed back toward the marina on that final afternoon, Suzi sat on the bow with her feet dangling over the edge, watching the sun drop toward the horizon and turning her dive computer over in her hands one more time. She thought about the turtle, the coral, the flashing ascent warning, and the quiet hum of the ocean. She thought about how much she still had to learn, and she smiled, because she knew that every dive from here on would teach her something new, and that little device on her wrist would be right there with her, counting every second, every meter, every breath.